I'm Dave Dinkle, and this is our video series of actual recent deals. This is an example of a $43,916.40 profit with no money in the deal and with two additional sources of income besides the regular profit on the deal itself. The following is a real estate deal that was recently completed by us or a student, and this deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how to do these types of transactions. So as not to embarrass anyone involved in the transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not an attorney, CPA, or realtor. Any information derived from this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. This is the example of a double closing with the first leg done with the student using transactional financing, so he had no money in the transaction. Seller A, the property owner, sells to the student, who's B, who then resells to the buyer C, all done on the same day. So it's a double closing. No money, student got transactional funding, and you're going to see that he didn't even have to have a deposit. He had no credit, there's no conventional lender involved. A transactional funder lended strictly on the merits of the transaction, and the end buyer C's money was in the account wired in before the transactional funder put his money into the account. No risk, because the student had no money in the transaction. In this particular transaction, when the student sold to his C end buyer, the original C end buyer did not come to closing, and the result was that he lost his deposit, and besides that, the student received the realtor's commission on the sale itself. So what we're looking at is getting three sources of income from a deal. This student looks for his deals by simply combing through the MLS, multiple listing service, and making very low offers on single-family homes. What's a low offer? Some people will tell you to make a 50% offer of the list price. That's a low offer. In some cases that may work, but it's not going to work in too many, especially in the market that we're in now. Low means somewhere between 60 and probably 75% at the most, not taking into account repairs or anything else. In this case, his offer was called stupid by the agent, but it happened to be later accepted at almost $60,000 below the listing price, simply because the seller was motivated to get rid of the property. Just because it's listed in the MLS doesn't mean you don't have motivated sellers. They may start out high, but somewhere along the line they have to make a final decision. I want out of the problem. Now the student advertised the property on Craigslist and with bandit signs, and he found a buyer for $25,000 more than what he had the property under contract for. Now remember, this is all happening during the inspection period, so in the event that the student couldn't find a buyer to close, he would not risk his deposit by canceling the contract. Well, the bad news or good news, depending on how you looked at it, was that the first buyer, the C buyer, originally decided not to close, and the student kept his earnest money deposit of $10,000. Now this is not shown in the HUD statements that we're going to go through because this leg of the transaction was never actually completed or closed. Now as soon as he lost this end buyer, the student had to remarket the property, and immediately he took a buyer for the same dollar amount, essentially the same profit amount. However, very shortly after he'd signed the contract with the new buyer, another buyer came along in with a $25,000 higher offer. However, the first buyer, C's contract was still valid, and he couldn't just cancel because he got a higher price, because he could be sued for breach of contract. This is a very common occurrence where you sign a contract with somebody and somebody else comes along and says, I'll give you 10 or 15 or 20 or $50,000 more than that contract. They really want it. However, you run two risks. First of all, infuriating the buyer whose contract you're canceling, and you might well be sued for breach of contract. Or if he's informed as a buyer or has an attorney who is, they will file a lis penance and start a foreclosure proceeding against your property just because they have a signed contract by you. They do not need a mortgage on a property to foreclose. This is an equitable interest in the property. The contract's been breached. We don't sue because it takes too long in court. Property's going to be transferred. The seller's going to be gone. What we do is we file a lis penance immediately, and it stops any possibility of that transaction being completed. So sometimes I'm going to say it pays to be slow in returning signed contracts. The student borrowed the earnest money deposit that was required by the listing agent, but in fact he never had to put it up. So he virtually had no money in the deal, and you'll see that in the HUD statement. The real estate commission on the sale was received by the investor's partner and was $12,323.40. It's not uncommon for two investors to partner on deals, one of whom's an agent, or in some cases both of them are agents, and they put themselves as an agent and as an investor buyer separately, or vice versa. Now the student's profit on the sale was the sale price $230,000 minus his purchase price $205,390. If you subtract the closing cost and transactional funding costs, it's $225,000 minus $203 and change, or $21,593 net profit on the transaction itself. But if you remember, the student had also been able to keep the first buyer's earnest money deposit of $10,000, and the result of those three was $12,323.40 plus the profit on the deal, $21,593, plus the $10,000 earnest money deposit, which came out to $43,916.40. Now, having said that, remember, another investor came in and offered a $25,000 higher profit. If that had happened, this number would have been obviously $68,000 instead of $43,000. A little hesitation on taking an offer could have resulted in $25,000 more. At this point, I want to mention something that's very, very important. When you're a seller and you send the contract out to a buyer, do not sign your contract until the contract comes back signed by your end buyer and you have the earnest money deposit in your hand as a cashier's check, money order, or it has more importantly been wired in to your closing agent. Otherwise, if you send the contract signed, this end buyer now has a signed contract by you. To get that contract canceled in writing so you can move ahead with another contract may wind up being very expensive for you to do. It could kill the deal. This has reared its ugly head a number of times in what we do, and we take care of it by don't sign the contract until your end buyer signs it first and you have the earnest money deposit. That will save you a lot of aggravation and time. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and look at the actual A to B and B to C transactions. The first one is the A to B, page 1. Again, what I've done is remove the individual players in this whole equation simply to save any sort of embarrassment. If you'll notice, buyer is on the left side, seller is on the right side. The student in this case is the buyer, the homeowner is the seller. Purchase price is $205,390. You say to me, why is it such an odd amount? Frankly, it doesn't matter. It was actually an adjustment just before the closing on the price that they had originally agreed to. The seller gets the same price on the HUD statement. These are the closing costs carried over from page 2. We'll see those in a moment. Now these are the settlement charges for the seller. This is the homeowner selling the property, what he's paying to sell. The investor is paying $629. It looks like the homeowner is paying $23,823. We'll see why on page 2. There's also no deposit. What I wanted you to see here is where the deposit would normally be on this line. There isn't any. The student didn't put up a deposit. On the recent deals that I've done, I've noted a number of times there's no earnest money deposit, which is hard for most people to grasp, but the reality is, believe it or not, I'm showing it to you on the HUD statement, and it can be done if you just learn how to do it. Now there's a payoff of a note in here, an only mortgage of $179,000. So this property had equity in it, but it had a motivated seller who wanted out. County taxes, these are accrued taxes from the beginning of the year. They're the same for both the buyer and seller. The seller's account is debited, and the end buyer, our student, in this case, the B buyer, is in fact credited with the same amount. So the student wound up paying $203,451.90 some cents, and the end buyer wound up getting $204,390 even. Okay, this is the HUD statement A to B, page 2. You'll notice up here that the biggest item on the page is $12,000 and change. 232 is $12,232 as the commission. I mentioned this to you on another either insight or previous deal. Here's POC, means paid outside of closing. These can be costs or expenses that came out of pocket of either the buyer or seller before the closing costs. They could include a partnership fee that was paid to someone else that was in the transaction. This is a settlement our closing fee, settlement or closing fee to the seller, the homeowner, is higher, as you can see, and that's just because of whatever reason was included. His attorney wanted to charge more. Doesn't matter. You're the student on this side of the equation. He also paid an abstract or title search. Again, this is the seller paying this. Some of you are thinking, well, the buyer is supposed to pay that. There is no supposed to in real estate investing. It's what is usual and customary in the county or state that you're in, and by simply putting it in the document, the original purchase and sale agreement, as to who pays whatever the other party pays. As the buyer, you'd always like the seller to pay, and you'd like to choose the closing agent. And if you put that in your contract, that's negotiable, and it can happen. Now, there's some attorney's fees, and there is also some title insurance. These attorney's fees are related to a different part of the transaction from the seller's side. An outside attorney got paid on the HUD statement. Title insurance policy is straightforward and standard. Here's an additional attorney's fees, and these are much more expensive, and this has to coincidentally is involved with a probate issue. So here we have some lien search fees and various recording fees and doc stamp fees and all those things that you'd pay normally in a transaction, lien search and so on. So as I mentioned to you previously, the student is paying about $529, it looks like, and the seller is paying $23,000. The biggest chunk of which is the commission, as well as attorney's fees for other things he was involved in before he got to the transaction. So this is the HUD statement, the B to C side, and it's page 1. Left side we have the buyer, who happens to be in this case the end buyer, and he's paying $230,000, and the student is receiving as a credit $230,000 at the same time. Now these are the buyer's expenses, the end buyer's expenses from page 2, which we're going to go back and look at. Here's the end buyer's deposit. What we had here is the student required that the end buyer C put up $10,000 as a deposit, which he did. If he hadn't closed, he would have collected that $10,000. Now that's very easily said. It's not always easily done. The way we do it is we have clauses in our contracting that authorize the closing agent to automatically distribute the earnest money deposit if in fact the end buyer doesn't close and the end buyer signs that as part of the contract. That alleviates the hassle of the end buyer saying, I'm not going to sign any release of funds, and effectively the closing agent winds up just holding the money in escrow indefinitely. So these are the settlement charges for the student as the seller from the second page, and these are again accrued taxes. If you go back and check, you'll see they're the same accrued taxes as they were on the A to B transaction, simply because it was done the same day. So the bottom line is that the buyer C had to bring in $219,000 and change. The student walked away with $225,074 and change. And the student walked away with $225,074.95. Now here we are on the HUD closing statement, the B to C again, page 2. As you'll notice, there's a processing fee up here. This is something new that's a junk charge by many of the real estate brokers, pure profit to them. They do this because their payouts to some of their agents have gone from 50-50 to 95-5, 5 being the broker, or 100% and 0 to the broker. They can't make money. There's no benefit if they can't get part of the commission to do this other than charging a processing fee. Now, why do they do that? Because they hope that they have a buyer as a house buyer that they can split the commission with the agent that brought it in, the listing agent. So here we have some settlement or closing costs, just as we had on the other one. They're both the same amount. And the abstract or title search, again, title insurance. This side of the B to C transaction is much cleaner than the A to B transaction because the seller, the A seller, had all kinds of stuff going on for him with legal issues to close out the transaction, which he paid for. These are processing fees, recording fees rather. These are doc stamps. Oh, this is a recording affidavit fee, and this is the actual recording cost. In our state, everything's done electronically, and every one of the electronic recordings has a fee associated with it when you do it. So what they're doing here is charging that fee back. Here's the amount as a bottom line. For the end buyer C, paid $1,750 $15 or so. Student paid $2,467.62 as his total amount of cost to do the transaction. So here's the final result of this transaction. The student contracted the property off the MLS. Now, I didn't say the student bought the property because he didn't buy it until he double closed it. It was a blind offer, meaning he didn't go out and see the properties. And it was in his farm area. What's farm area? It doesn't mean he's a farmer. It means he's picked certain zip codes to work in. He makes offers on whatever he feels like in that area. In this case, listed property. This happened to have been a probate. More probably a coincidence than anything else. Just once he got it under contract, signed, he had an equitable interest in the property that allowed him to then market and sell the property anywhere except on the MLS, the multiple listing service, unless he had written approval from the seller. And if you went to the seller and said, I need written approval to re-advertise your property, it becomes a source of friction possibly, because the seller is saying to himself, why are you remarketing it? You must not have paid me enough. I didn't receive enough money for it. If you're able to resell it immediately and make even $10,000, why should I do this with you? Why isn't my agent selling it for more money? But at any rate, he marketed the property in the neighborhood with a bandit sign, and he was able to get a contract just after actually a day and a half. The student used transactional funding for the A to B side of the transaction. Coincidentally, I supplied it. The student did not put up an earnest money deposit on the A to B leg, even though he had borrowed it and he had it ready. But he did require his end buyer to put up $10,000, and that $10,000 requirement earned him an additional $10,000 on the transaction because the first seller didn't close. The net profit on this no out-of-pocket money deal, as I mentioned to you before, was the agent's commission plus the profit spread plus the lost earnest money deposit, which is $43,916.40. The point of my doing these recent deals is to get people who are watching this to understand you don't need money to do transactions if you learn the ways that you can use other people's money, borrow money for short term, or whatever you have to do that's legal that will allow you to do this. So here's a student that prior to this time, let's say this was his first deal. It wasn't, but there's no reason it couldn't have been. He is walking away with a $43,000 profit on one deal. So this can be done. We do it on a regular basis. Thanks very much for joining us today. Looking forward to you doing deals with no money, no credit, and no risk.